Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Conference. Just a quick logistical note before we start today's sessions. You're now watching the breakout room session on biological weapons. As you will see on the right side of your screen, there is the possibility to submit questions to the speakers. It will now ask you to select a room. Please pick the blue dot that says biological weapons, so you'll submit them to this breakout room. At the top of the screen, you'll see a little tab that says breakout session live stage. If you click on it, you will also be able to move on to the main stage, where right now the artificial intelligence session is taking place. Doing that, you will be able throughout the session to move from one session to the other, should you wish to somehow watch both. Enjoy the conference.
Good morning and welcome to this session on biological weapons and pandemics. My name is Filippa Lentzos and I will be moderating this wonderful panel of analytic powerhouses this morning that are going to drive our conversation. We have three speakers with us in the panel. First up is Iris Hunger, followed by Jez Littlewood, both of whom I go back with for quite some years. We first met in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Both are in this rather unique position of having worked on the BWC, the Biological Weapons Convention, from within the UN, but also as part of a government or a delegation, as well as part of the NGO community. So they really provide a very well-rounded perspective on the Biological Weapons Convention. They've both since gone on to do different things, but they remain engaged in the BWC and biological disarmament and are absolute experts. So I'm really, really pleased to have them both here. Jez Littlewood is a policy analyst in the government of Alberta in Canada. Iris is part of the German National Public Health Institute. Both are here in this session in their private capacities, not speaking in official capacities. We also have with us Ambassador Aidan Liddle, who is the CD, the permanent representative to the CD, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, representing from the UK. He very much speaks authoritatively and absolutely on behalf of the government, signed off by the Queen herself. And so we are very, very pleased to have you here. Aidan, you provide that more immediate and up-to-date perspective on all the nitty-gritties that are going on in Geneva at the moment. Today, we're here to talk about biological weapons and pandemics. What we're aiming for in this session is more of a conversation style type of panel rather than a set of sort of formal presentations followed by a Q&A. We very much welcome audience participation, so please do type your questions into the chat function and we'll weave them in as we progress through our conversation. We are, as I said, just to stress, very keen to have your engagement and your questions as well. So we do have just an outstanding panel of speakers today. So do keep those questions coming. So let's get down to business. What I thought we'd kick off with is a sort of fairly general question to set the scene, where each one of our speakers will give us some very brief thoughts on on how they perceive the implications of COVID-19. So Iris, if I could first turn to you and ask how you see COVID-19 impacting on the link between natural and deliberate disease outbreaks, essentially this link between the health world and the security world.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to start with saying thank you to the organizers and for inviting me here, although I haven't been a close member of the bioweapons control community for a few years now. But I'm very happy to be here. It always feels nice to be back in this round of experts. The COVID-19 pandemic has been called the once-in-a-century crisis. It has also been called the biggest health crisis of the last 100 years. And if you look at the numbers, this is actually true. I mean, we have almost 52 million cases now worldwide, with almost 1.3 million deaths. And what is really different to pandemics, well, to big outbreaks, health crisis before, is that we have 220 countries and territories with cases now. So this is a true pandemic. It basically reaches every last corner of the world. There's also enormous social and economic impact on almost anyone and anything around the world. And I'm sure there's no one in the audience who has not felt the impact of COVID-19 to a larger or lesser degree. I mean, businesses have to close, the trade stopped for quite some time, and it's still very restricted. Everyone feels that when there are spare parts for bicycles not being delivered to Europe and stuff like that. So it's kind of like everyone can feel it in their daily lives, but of course on a statewide scale, the numbers are much bigger. Schools closed. The working life for many people is in shatters. They either lost their jobs or they cannot go to work because they have to take care of their children. And the economic numbers also show that effect. The economic deadline in the second quarter relative to 2019 is very different around the world, but it's everywhere negative. It ranges from -3% in South Korea through 6% in Nigeria, 10% in the US, 12% in my own country, Germany, 17%, -17% in Malaysia, and for instance, -22%, so a quarter of the GDP in Spain. There's also, of course, effects on traveling. International, even locally, traveling has become very difficult. And last but not least, as a public health person, the health effects that are unrelated to COVID are also very strong. Just think about the mental health of people who are not allowed to have their usual social life. What is also interesting is that for the first time, I mean, this pandemic has been a great equalizer. What we usually call Western countries are disproportionately affected. And I remember in the beginning that was just a very unusual feeling for a state like Germany, for a state like Italy, for a state like Spain. I remember there were these dire predictions what havoc COVID would cause in Africa. Because if it was so bad for us, I mean, just imagine how bad it would be for them. Yeah, these arguments were in the room, but these catastrophic news never came. And Africa is actually now one of the continents where there is comparatively, I'm not saying nothing and I'm not saying little, but comparatively, they are comparatively little affected. There are different reasons for that, and we are not entirely sure why that's the case, but it's certainly true that this is a big equalizer. And that brings me to your question, Filippa. I think what COVID shows in terms of natural versus deliberate outbreaks is that we are all very vulnerable to disease outbreaks, small and big. Of course, not everyone is affected equally, but even if you think you're well prepared, there might be outbreaks that just overwhelm you. Even if these are diseases with little lethality, I mean, the numbers about lethality, of course, there's a range to that, but they are well below 10%, well below 5%. And even if there is a relative low degree of lethality, the damage to health, but also to the greater socioeconomic is devastating. And in terms of has the pandemic actually influenced security? There have been a few violent protests, but I think this is not a hard security issue. We cannot talk about that. So in summary, I think there is relatively little about the two merging, the world of security and the world of health in this respect. There are small things like the military helping out with contact tracing, for instance, or with looking after quarantine and isolation. But otherwise, I think this is a public health crisis of international concern, and that's it. So I would stop here.
Thank you so much, Iris. I think that's been a really helpful, getting us off to a good start and a really helpful overview of how the pandemic is impacting, and also very interesting comments about this relationship between the security world and the health world, and how certainly at the local or national level, there hasn't been much engagement. I actually think we're seeing that also to some extent at the international level, that the security and the health world to date have not had a massive interaction. I see Ambassador Liddle nodding along here, and I would ask you, Ambassador, how you see the impact of COVID-19 on biological disarmament.
Thanks. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is, of course, that there is no evidence that COVID-19 was anything to do with biological weapons or biological weapons programs. I think, we heard at the beginning of this crisis back in February, March, various conspiracy theories about the roles of various laboratories or what have you. But obviously, that there is absolutely no evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic stems from any activity banned under the BWC. But I think, following very well on from what Iris just said, what the pandemic does show is that these sorts of threats are very real, and that biological agents, pathogens, can have absolutely devastating effects, not just on human lives, but on human livelihoods and human societies and economies. So I think, from that point of view, really COVID-19 is a wake-up call, because it shows that these threats are real and need to be taken seriously. Even if this pandemic was natural, future ones may not be, and we need to tackle that. So I think that really is the sort of the first thing for me is that we need to sort of relearn the lessons. Now, I suppose there's a couple of other things to say about that. One is that obviously COVID-19 is a human pandemic, by and large, unless you're a mink in Denmark, in which case it's been pretty bad for you as well. But but of course, when we look at biological weapons issues in the BWC community, we're not just looking at human pathogens, we're also looking at plant pathogens, and we're also looking at animal pathogens. And that's because, again, these sorts of things can have devastating effects on food security, obviously targeting pathogens at particular crops, which are important for either food security or for livelihoods in a certain area. And it's the same with animals as well. And obviously, as we've seen, not just with COVID-19, but previous outbreaks as well, obviously animals can also be a transmitter species to humans. So in biological weapons terms, we need to look very much at plant and animal pathogens as well as at human ones. I suppose the other thing that it shows is that we weren't as prepared as we thought we were. We have been talking about health risks for years. The 2010 Security and Defence Review in the UK identified pandemic flu as being one of our major national security risks. And we prepared very well for pandemic flu. Of course, this was not pandemic flu. And it showed that the preparations we'd made weren't actually applicable to other threats that perhaps we hadn't looked at as seriously, at least in Europe. I suppose it also shows that, like all generals, we were probably fighting the last battle. Perhaps we did learn the lessons from the 1918 flu, or from SARS, or from MERS, but they weren't actually the lessons that helped us prepare properly for this pandemic. So I think it shows the importance. It shows that we didn't necessarily ignore health risks, but we perhaps weren't thinking flexibly or open enough about what sort of risk we might be facing and what sort of things we needed to do to prepare for it. I mean, obviously there will be, when this is all over, there will be years, I suppose, of inquiries and investigations, and we will certainly have lessons. But I think the important thing is that we don't take the wrong lessons or the lessons from this episode that don't prepare us for the future. So I suppose that's the first sort of basket of issues. The second one, perhaps, and I'm a bureaucrat here, so I make no apologies for talking about process, is that ironically the major impact of COVID-19 for the BWC has been that it's knocked the BWC machinery off its rails. You know, this is the final year before we have the 9th Review Conference in 2021. This was we were supposed to have a round of experts meetings in the summer, in August, which would have been the last opportunity, really, 10 days of experts meetings to prepare those detailed proposals for the RevCon. Those meetings had to be postponed. Obviously, the experts couldn't travel to Geneva to have those meetings. There was no agreement on having them in a different format virtually for various reasons. And of course, most of the experts were themselves busy with dealing with the pandemic. So in a way, at a time when the BWC really should be front and center of some of these discussions, or at least, you know, the BWC should be examining what it means for us, we have been unable to get people together and really have those discussions. So we're hoping the meetings will happen in December as rescheduled, but obviously, you know, the restrictions are still in place and it's going to be difficult. So we've got a lot of work to do in the BWC if we're going to really make the most of the lessons we can learn and prepare ourselves properly for the 9th Review Conference this time next year.
Thank you so much, Aidan. Those were all points very, very well taken. We're all kind of watching with great anticipation about what might happen now in the next few weeks and whether the BWC MX meetings will really go ahead or not. Hopefully we'll have some clarity on that soon so we can prepare properly if they are to go ahead as they are currently scheduled. Also, your point about COVID-19 being applicable to humans, but that there are other threats out there. For those who haven't followed the BWC in recent years, Dr. Hunger, Dr. Littlewood, there has been a lot more discussion actually of anti-animal and especially anti-plant threats. And I think that has been a very welcome development. But can I turn to you now, Jez, for any thoughts that you might have on the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks, Filippa. And let me also, as Aidan and Philip, as Iris mentioned, thank you for the invitation here. I agree with a lot of what's previously been said in terms of the range of potential impacts. So I think I'll focus my first comments on what's the impact on the BWC and really what's the impact going forward on the 9th Review Conference and before. I mean, there are some potential positive impacts here. It can focus minds. It can give us sort of impetus to rethinking about the convention and its role in international security because, as you know, everyone said, the pandemic has revealed some of our weaknesses and some of the sort of, you know, expectations are, instead of being like, oh, that could happen, are definitely like, oh, it has happened. So, you know, the positive aspects could be a refocusing. I'm going to, however, focus a little bit now on some of the negative aspects that could flow from this. And I mean, one of them is, I don't buy into this as an individual as yet, but there's a lot of talk around, because of the scale of the pandemic and its implications, that this may choose some nefarious actors to rethink biological weapons going forward. I think that's a fair comment, and I think it's certainly a risk or a potential threat environment everyone needs to pay attention to. But there's also an aspect here of it's seizing a kind of window of opportunity among policy makers and policy advocates here who can find sort of a ready press to sort of publicize their views. So it's out there, but maybe take it at this stage with a little bit of skepticism. I think the more significant impact for the review conference in the BWC is it's going to harden views. It's going to harden existing views. And this is particularly the case, I think, when we think about divisions between North-South, key Western states and the likes of Iran and potentially China, Pakistan and Cuba, because they're highly likely to turn up in Geneva late next year, and let's assume we meet in Geneva late next year, and it'll be, I told you so. We need peaceful cooperation. You need to get rid of your export controls because, hey, look at Iran and all the challenges it's faced. So it's going to harden thinking, and I think it will be seized and used as a frame to achieve existing political objectives. Now, that's not right or wrong per se, but I think that's something we have to think about. The other aspect, I think, flowing from this is it's also offered further evidence about the challenges we face in transparency and in investigations. You know, the investigation by the WHO, according to at least the New York Times this week, is not going so well in China. And well, those sorts of challenges are not new, and they're certainly not new to us in a disarmament environment because we've experienced them before in Iraq. We've experienced them previously in the trilateral process between Russia and the UK and the US, trying to get at the bottom of the Soviet program. But I think it underlines to us that there's a distinction between kind of nice words and commitments made by states and the reality on the ground, which can often be a little bit obstructionist and sometimes making life as difficult as possible. And so I think the flowing one thing I'll say then, there's also going to be some areas where this won't have an impact on the BWC, or it won't affect some fundamental aspects of the BWC. And one of the challenges, I think, if we think about the pandemic as a potential kind of catalyst for change about what we do in the convention going forward, in the, like, kind of a future work program or something like that, it's going to be really difficult to get states parties behind that, because if you want to achieve things in the BWC in terms of substance going forward, you've got to spend more time in Geneva in meetings. And to do that, you've got to spend more money. And the pandemic has strained everybody's fiscal reality. So convincing 100+ states parties to kind of make good on promises in the BWC and take advantage of what the pandemic has been showing us, how important this is, I think that's going to be a really hard sell next year in reality in the conference room. So there are some sort of, issues which it's not probably going to move things forward or impact them so much, is my view at this stage. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jez. Really a lot of food for thought there, and so many issues that we can pick up on and speak on. The one that I wanted to just stress or highlight was your thought that COVID-19 and our experience with COVID-19 will be seized on and used as a frame to achieve existing objectives. I think we've seen that already in first committee discussions around the BWC, where it's all focused back on the need for verification. We'll pick that up a little bit later in this conversation. But for now, I wanted to explore the link between natural and deliberate disease outbreaks a little bit more. And I wondered if Iris or Dr. Hunger, as I think I should be referring to you, it just feels a bit awkward, having known you personally for so many years. But if you could tell us a little bit about how a deliberate outbreak differs from a natural pandemic in terms of how you identify what kind of outbreak it is and how it impacts on human health and public public disruption, essentially.
Thank you for the question. Yeah. Well, there have been many clever people who thought about that, and there actually are many lists of criteria that can be used to differentiate between a natural outbreak and the deliberate outbreak. And basically what all these lists say is that if there's anything unusual then the alarm bells should ring, and you should probably give a bit of thought to a possible deliberate hostile background to that outbreak. Now, what could be strange? Strange could be geographic distribution. If you find a pathogen in an area where it's usually not appearing, if there is a high concentration of the agent in the environment, that would also be very strange. Or if there is a different mode of transmission, if you have a disease that you usually see as a foodborne disease, suddenly happening in a person-to-person transmission, if the intensity is strange, if you have suddenly 10 times the number of cases than you had last year at the same time, or if the timing is wrong. You know, we have these seasonal diseases that come and go with the seasons. If they are appearing in the wrong season, then you should give a thought. Now, as COVID has shown, quite a few of these criteria can also happen with natural outbreaks. It just has to be a new pathogen appearing. And that's happening all the time. It's not just the ones that move up to be a public health emergency of international concern, as the World Health Organization defines them. There are many more agents that are discovered every year that are causing disease, fortunately at a very low level. So all of these criteria can only be kind of like alarm bells to a certain degree, but they are no proof. And the only other thing that's also important is that if there are indications from the security side in a country that there are threats to use biological agents, or that there is an increased activity in certain extremist groups, for instance, and you can observe a conversation in the social media on using certain diseases as weapons, etc. If that comes together with such a strange appearance of a disease, then of course the alarm bells should ring even louder. But even then, it might still be natural. But then the evidence and the need to look into it more closely builds up. I think what I would say is also that infections like COVID, like SARS-CoV, the virus that can infect people in a people-to-people transmission without those people being symptomatic. So people that appear completely healthy but can still infect others. This is like the nightmare scenario. Yeah, if that was coupled with even a higher lethality, that would be the absolute nightmare of any public health person, and of course also of any security person. I leave it at that.
Thank you, Iris. So essentially, if there is some kind of outbreak and we don't know, there is nobody that claims responsibility, it could be very hard to tell if it's a natural outbreak or a deliberate outbreak. And that's where you need to start looking for these, what you call strange things. I wanted just to follow up on your elaboration there to ask whether from a public health perspective, international or national responses should differ to an outbreak, whether or not it's natural or deliberate. So how do we initially respond to natural or deliberate outbreaks? Is there a difference there?
Once you have an outbreak, once you have cases of disease, I think the reaction, at least from the public health side that I'm looking from these days, there is no big difference. There is a humanitarian need to kind of try to stop the outbreak as early as possible, and then take care of the people who do get sick. And basically, the activities that you have to do are very much the same on the health side. You have to kind of get an overview of where the cases are, so you have to have a surveillance system in place. You need to quarantine and isolate people, the sick and the possibly infected. You need to have your laboratory diagnosis capabilities in place so that you can actually differentiate between someone who has the disease and someone who has not. And of course, you need to have your healthcare system ready to cope. including enough intensive care units, which have been a problem with COVID-19 in some countries. So there's also this need to surge, which is kind of like build up capacity quickly. And you might remember this huge hospital in Wuhan in China that the Chinese built within days, basically. Yeah, you could actually see the hospital growing out of the ground. And so this surge capacity is in those very, very big epidemics, very big outbreaks is very important. But that's, again, independent of whether it's natural or deliberate. You have to have a good risk communication strategy. We tend to forget that still, although we know how important it is. You have to have a strategy to deal with all the rumors and misinformation around diseases that appear. Of course, you need to look into burial management in case of diseases. And we had that in New York, sadly, that there were problems with that when they had so many cases. Of course, as a government, you also need to look into the effects on the social and economic scale and try to relieve those. Also planning for how to restart your economy. If, like in COVID, you can see that there will be a big dip in your economic activity. And last but not least, the research and development activities that need to take place are also very, very similar. If there's no diagnostic available, you need to develop diagnostic tools. If there are no therapies, or you don't know which therapies are working for that particular disease, or as we now see with COVID, the vaccine, if we need to develop a vaccine. I almost stop here, but one very last point. The only difference that I do see is that there is a new coordination requirement if it's a deliberate outbreak. If it's a deliberate outbreak, the public health actors need to get in close contact with the security actors to kind of like help each other find out, okay, where's the source of the outbreak? Is there a continuing source? This is something that public health actors increasingly know they have to do, but especially at the local level, it's not often very well implemented, depending also on the need, of course. If there are things, I mean, if there are incidences of threats, for instance, then this is different. Then the local health communities are also more aware. But I would say, in general, the local communities don't have this very close interaction with the security community. Thank you.
Thanks, Iris. Jez, I wondered if I could bring you in here on an international security policy perspective, and whether you see differences in responses there in terms of national and international responses to whether an outbreak is a natural outbreak or a deliberate outbreak.
Yeah, thanks, Filippa. I mean, I think Iris raised all the many of the key issues in the sense of, you have an outbreak of disease, and this is a public health issue, and you assume it's a public health issue unless you've got unusual things that need explaining or indeed can't be explained. So, I mean, that might be, let's, for argument's sake, if there's a huge outbreak of plague in Geneva, that's unusual, but it's also going to be a public health emergency response locally, at least, with lots of security people maybe like, okay, we need to look at this, and there'll be that coordination. But I mean, if we assume that we've moved to a position in an outbreak where there are suspicions that it's not a natural event, and we think it's probably not a laboratory or other kind of accident, so we're getting into the territory of it's a deliberate use of disease, then I think what happens nationally or internationally rather depends on where you are. I'd have confidence, that most OECD countries, China and a lot of other countries, they already have the capacity to do that public health, national security coordination themselves. So in one sense, it would presumably be dealt with at a national level, unless it was a kind of outbreak that was crossing borders and becoming either an epidemic, particularly. But I suspect this is a different issue if you're dealing with a country that lacks the capacity to address the potential aspects of, oh, this is a deliberate event. Somebody has potentially attacked us. And there, I think for a country like that, they're going to turn to the international community for assistance. And the place to go, I mean, if you're a BWC states party, then yeah, you could potentially invoke Article 5 for consultation and cooperation. You could potentially go down the road of Article 6 and ask the Security Council for an investigation. But the challenge there with the Security Council is, of course, the veto issue. So there's no guarantee any of the P5 will want to play ball with you, depending on who you are and whose side you may be perceived to be on. So then you end up at the UN Secretary General's investigation mechanism. And it's the Secretary General's investigation mechanism, which is that kind of independent technical capability that's on call to you if you're a state that lacks the capacity or lacks this kind of assurance that you can do this yourself. And there you end up with issues around, okay, well, who are the experts? Who are the roster of experts the Secretary General will call upon? The logistics of getting into the country, but there it's also into things such as what are the investigation techniques? Is there, are they following a handbook that everyone's going to accept that if we determine this is a deliberate use, or we determine no, it's a natural outbreak, is everybody going to accept the kind of the procedures, the chain of custody issues, the quality of the evidence and the kind of evidence? So you end up with a few issues which for some countries, particularly at the international level, you could be dependent on the Secretary General's mechanism, or you could be dependent on the BWC's Article 6 mechanism, which, to be honest, no one has ever worked out in detail what would happen there. So no one's probably going down that road anytime soon. So I think that's the key issue. But we still have to go back, even on this circle, is just to remember, it's a public health issue first and foremost. It has international security dimensions potentially, but even if it does have those dimensions, it's still a public health issue as well. And one side, the security should never be pushing the health to one side in this discussion.
Thanks, Jez. I think really what we're seeing with the COVID now is how this interplay between public health and security needs to be better worked out at the international level. There's a lot of work to do there. Jez, you also talked about investigations, and we've had a lot of questions come in on the chat. So thank you for those, and two of which relate to investigations. So I'm just going to throw those out to you. But before I do so, I know Aidan would like to come in just on this last point. So Aidan, please do come in.
Thanks very much. No, it's been really interesting listening to Iris and Jez on this. I think I'd just bring two quick points out on the difference between a sort of deliberate and a natural outbreak. One is that just to pick up on something Jez said about a deliberate use. Of course, the BDWC is engaged not just on deliberate use, but also on Article 1 talks about development, production, stockpiling of microbial or other biological agents, toxins, whatever their origin or method of production, of types and in quantities that have no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. So actually, there's a whole category of activities in there which stops short of deliberate use, which might also engage the BDWC. So if there was evidence, for example, that an outbreak had been caused by an accident or some non-deliberate event, but arising from activities which gave rise to suspicion under the BTWC, that would engage the BWC as well, not just deliberate use. And I think the second point I wanted to make was that I agree with everything Iris said about the sort of the main public health and government response domestically being much the same, depending on a deliberate or natural outbreak. The political reaction, of course, would be extremely different. I mean, we've already seen in terms of some of the recriminations between the US and China about the origins of the COVID-19 outbreak. Political tensions can be heightened even by a natural outbreak. outbreak. If there was suspicion or evidence that there was a deliberate outbreak, of course, you would be talking about a major escalation in tensions, depending on the players involved. But, you would be talking not just about the Security Council and investigations, but you would potentially be talking about, very serious political or even military escalation as well. So that's a big difference too.
Thanks, Aidan. Any quick responses from Iris or Jez to any of those points? No. Okay, great. Then Jez, no, great. Then I'll just move on to these questions that we've got in from the chat on investigations, which you raised briefly there, Jez, in your earlier comments. So we've got a couple of names familiar to us who have come in. So Ian Anthony is asking, hello Ian, is asking, are tools for investigation or attribution of alleged deliberate use, including the role of forensic science and law enforcement, a BWC focus, as it is in the CWC? So are tools for investigation or attribution of alleged deliberate use, a focus in the BWC? That's the first question, Jez, that I'll put to you in a minute. And the second question that's come in around investigations is from Gunnar Jeremias. Hi, Gunnar. Asking whether open networks or single researchers who have a role to play in investigating alleged biological weapons use. So is there a role for moving investigations out of the sole territory of states and into a wider, I think, civil society role, giving civil society a role there too? At least that's how I read that question. So Jez, if you would be happy to quickly speak to those points, to speak
Sure.
to investigations a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll deal with Gunnar's and hi Gunnar issue first. I mean, is there a role for civil society here? Yes, there is. Of course there is. If we think about the first identification of COVID, or at least my awareness of it, it's the December 31st ProMed mail alert, which is civil society. This is a surveillance by a civil society group. If we think about unusual outbreaks of disease elsewhere or other outbreaks of disease, that there's a group of individuals that are well connected, whether it's in ProMed or whether it's in other kinds of groups, which will say, hold on a second, something unusual is happening here with a disease outbreak. So there is a role. Now, whether or not, in terms of an investigation that is going to stand up to the kind of scrutiny that states will put on the outcome of any investigation, that civil society can do that, I'm not convinced that's the case as yet. For the simple reason is, who gave you the authority? What's a chain of custody? What's your standard operational procedures? Is your investigation team made up of different groups of independent experts with different capabilities? I mean, all these things could, in one sense, happen. But I think without that kind of mandate to investigate, that's going to be a challenge. So I think there's limits to what civil society or other non-state groups can do. In terms of Ian's issue, I think this is where we get into the challenge of the BWC today. Are forensics, are thinking about investigation techniques, procedures, and all those things a live issue in the BWC? Well, kind of yes and kind of no. I mean, yes, in terms of if you follow the discussions, there are some kind of good detailed debates on, okay, what would we do in an investigation? Lessons from tabletop exercises, people thinking through at a national level or a like-minded level, how would we put an investigation together? What do we need to do? But it's no in reality, because it doesn't actually deliver anything in the BWC. We're no closer in the convention to having a detailed investigation capability. And I'm not at all hopeful we're going to get there very soon either. So, is it comparable to the CWC and all the things it's learned over the last decade? No, it's not. Is it ignored by BWC states parties? No, but I think some states parties are far more interested in it than others. But it's probably not going anywhere within the BWC anytime soon.
Thank you, Jazz. So there's been there's a whole raft of questions out there for you guys. So one of the questions that's come in, which a lot of people have kind of liked, I think, or I don't know how you're doing that, but this seems to be one we absolutely need to answer. And essentially, it's from Rafael Prenat, who says, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic can renew an interest for potential non-state or state actors to develop some biological weapons? And I think I would sort of translate that question to very briefly, is there an increasing risk of disease being used as a weapon? And so what I would like to do is to ask for very short answers from all three of you. Do you think that is the case? Again, very short, because we do have a lot more to get through, and this is a super interesting topic. Can we start with you, Aidan?
Yes, and I can be very brief because I agree. Yes, I think there is a risk of that. I think not only have we seen the sort of destruction and devastation and disruption that these events can cause, and that, of course, as was said earlier, can be very interesting to certain non-state groups. But also, you know, the sort of the new technologies and the spread of knowledge on how to use these sorts of techniques is also much broader than before. So, you know, it's much easier now. You don't have to have a state-funded lab to do some of this stuff now and to have some of the effect. So actually, both the interest and I suspect the opportunity from non-state groups in these techniques is on the rise, and we should be worried about that.
Thank you, Aidan. Jez, you warned us in your opening remarks about hyping the threat. Do you want to, is that the still?
I mean, is there a growing risk? Yes, there is a growing risk. And a few actors thinking short term may look at COVID and say, oh, this makes it look more interesting. But you know, a risk is not a threat. A threat requires a capability to do something and an intention to do it. Now, notwithstanding that there is a very wide spectrum of potential biological agents you could use, some are literally disruptions, some could be much more fatal and much more deadly. Is the risk increasing? Yes, it is. But I think the more important things in that risk assessment, they precede COVID, and it's the science and technological aspects around lowering the barriers to bioweapons, which, you know, all the S&T reports say. And I think there's also something else which is beginning to come up it's come up over the last few years. And it's the lack of ability to respond to the violations in the Chemical Weapons Convention fundamentally lead to questions about our ability to enforce the norms against both chemical and biological weapons. And that inability itself poses other aspects to this new risk level. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, there certainly are some worrying trends there, and the potential spillover from what's going on in the chemical side into the biological side is not good. And we want to make sure we maintain our red lines in the biological sphere. Iris, can I bring you in here about how you think, whether you think there is an increasing risk today of disease being used as a weapon?
Just very quickly, I think, yes, the interest might grow, but I don't see that the capabilities grow through COVID. So I don't think there's a higher threat there.
Thank you for those reassuring words. There's another question here from a slightly different angle from Thomas Brown, who says, with COVID-19 showing the truly global nature of biological threats, do you believe that the pandemic can help boost the push for universalization of the BWC? And I think here, what we've just seen at First Committee in New York in the last few weeks is that many delegations emphasize that COVID-19 underscored the need to strengthen the BWC, but that strengthening the BWC means different things to different delegations. Certainly universalization is one of those aspects. There are many others. So for some, that means greater international cooperation. Jez already alluded to that earlier. It could mean more assistance and more preparedness. it could be more finances and sustained support for the treaty, essentially, more institutional support. For some, they bring up codes of conduct or science advisory boards or additional layers of transparency. So I wonder here, Aidan, bearing the initial question in mind around universalization, but kind of broadening it out to how do we strengthen the BWC? Where do you see the key opportunities being to strengthen the BWC? Where do you, and importantly, because it's not just about nice words, it is about action on the ground, as Jez reminded us, where do you think it's likely to see that we could see some movement at the upcoming review conference to strengthen the BWC?
So there's where to start with all this. There's a lot in there. I think firstly on universalization, actually what's encouraging about the BWC is that states are still joining it. It's been, the BWC has been in force for 40 years or more now. Even in the last 2 or 3 years, we have had a few of the states still outside it joining, and that shows for me that it's still relevant. That it's still a body that states see advantage in joining even so long afterwards. But of course, there are still a few states who are deliberately staying outside it for wider political reasons, particularly in the Middle East, and that's a worry because this will only really universalization is a really important goal, and we've seen that in the CWC, and I hope we don't have to wait until there is an incident comparable to that in Syria in 2013, which means that the final stragglers come into the BWC. That's really important. Now, in terms of areas to strengthen the BWC, I think there are a few which perhaps we can get on to how likely these are in a minute, but certainly where I think there is quite a lot of support for these sorts of things. I think the first thing is around the idea of a science and technological review function within the BWC. In the CWC there is a science advisory body. We don't have anything similar in the BWC. We obviously have our experts meetings, and they are places where experts can come in and update on developments. But I think what a lot of us are now thinking is that we need some sort of standing mechanism where we can have a proper sort of scientific review function, so that states parties can really understand what the latest developments are, what the impact of those developments are, what it means for the BWC, and so we can adapt accordingly. And that's not just on sort of new threats and investigations and that sort of thing, but it also does engage things like cooperation, education, national implementation. There's a lot that flows out from that. So I think that's a really important thing. I think it's also linked to that important to try and understand how we can get the biotech and pharma industry much more engaged in the BWC. Obviously, we rely very heavily on state experts and on experts from international organizations. But I think there is much more we can do to get the biotech and pharma industry engaged. In all sorts of ways, but I think that the science and technology review is one of them. Article 10 is probably another on cooperation. I think the second area is around improving response. So Article 7 of the convention is all about how states would offer assistance to a state who'd been exposed to these sorts of risks. And I think, there's been a lot of work going on in recent years about the sorts of things that states could do, either within the BWC framework or sort of outside it, but made available to the BWC framework about improving response. And I think that's important for two reasons. One, because as Iris was saying earlier, the initial response would be a public health response, and we need to make sure that we're prepared for that. But I think the other one is that the better the response, the better the preparation, the higher the barrier to a potential adversary. Being well prepared is a deterrent. You know, if an adversary knows that a state is very well prepared to deal with a pandemic or to deal with a disease outbreak, then actually it's a less attractive option. So I think both from the sort of public health response point of view, but also from the deterrence point of view, we need to look at response. And deterrence is something we haven't really thought much about in the BWC, I think, as we have in other security areas. And I think the third area, very briefly, is around investigation. And as Jez was saying earlier, I don't see any prospect of there being a sort of BWC proprietary investigation mechanism. But I do think, you know, the UNSGM is universal because it's owned by the General Assembly. It's there for everybody. It's independent because it's under the mandate of the Secretary General, not under the Security Council. And I think we really need to put a lot more effort into making sure that's ready and credible and ready to go if and when, God forbid, we ever need it.
Indeed. Thank you, Aidan. I'm, as chair, nervously watching the clock. It's 9:50, but thankfully the organisers have said we can stretch a little bit over. So we will, because I think it's really important for us to talk about verification. Verification is the traditional sticking point of the BWC. It's been signalled again that it is going to be a major issue in First Committee. It's been signalled in First Committee that it is going to be a major issue in the next review conference yet again. There's been also a question from the audience from Song Lee asking, pointing out that next year is the 20-year anniversary of the failure of the BWC verification protocol negotiations. Not an anniversary most of us would like to relive or reminded of, but asking for your reflections. So Iris, Jez, what are your thoughts? And please, very briefly, but what are your thoughts on verification in the BWC? Has the debate moved on at all since you were active in these discussions about 20 years ago, as we are reminded? Would either of you like to pick this up? Iris, maybe you could go first here.
Yeah, and quickly, because we are already at 10 o'clock. I don't see that the discussion has moved on. I actually, in preparation, looked at a paper of mine from well, not 20 but 10 years ago, and I basically thought that from what I know about the proceedings of the BWC, that's basically still unchanged. What I wanted to add to what Aidan said on verification already is the only important point that I want to add is we need some information monitoring capacity for the BWC. Given that the states are investing so little time and so little kind of brain effort into finding new ways, I think there needs to be an independent way of collecting information and analyzing it and then presenting it to the states parties. I think that would kind of make the whole thing much more dynamic. And just comparing it to the World Health Organization that got this responsibility, or it was allowed to actually use other information than those provided by states in 2003, that has changed the dynamics enormously. And I would just suggest thinking about giving, and it can be the Secretariat in Geneva, which is not an NGO because that would be very difficult, but giving in kind of like overarching body the ability to look at other than the information provided by states on issues relevant to the BWC. I think that would be, in my view, a big step forward, and probably one that at least we could hope had some chance of success. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. So, Jez, verification, I know you have strong feelings on this.
I do, but not enough time to vent them, I guess, really, in reality. I mean, I think has the debate moved on? Yes, in some respects, no in others. And I think at the moment, the important thing is, who is actually calling for verification at this point in time? Russia wants to go back there. Iran has never given up on going back there. Others all want to go back there. These are the very same states who have rejected, disrupted, challenged, and tried to overturn verification in the CWC on investigations of use for the last 3 years. So I think, is verification on the table? Yes, it's going to be on the table. But let's be at least aware of the hypocrisy that's going on here among some states. And let's also be aware there's a lot of political opportunism going on here. And I'll kind of end on the verification thing is basically, we're not ready. Okay, even if states parties magically decide to go back to negotiations next December in some agreement, it'll almost certainly fail again, or it'll be a 10-year exercise because no one's ready. No one's done the preparatory work to think, what does verification look like in the next sort of 30 years of the 21st century? So I think if anyone is going to sort of put these issues on the table, as an outsider, I would basically ask every single state the same three basic questions. How much money are you willing to spend strengthening the BWC? How much time are you willing to give to do that? And what's your vision? What's your vision for the convention beyond its 50th anniversary in 2025? Because unless you have a serious plan to put on the table, you are not essentially serious about this issue of verification. We need, as states parties, in my view, 5 years of preparatory effort to prepare any chance of having a detailed discussion about verification and compliance in some form of additional agreement or additional agreements in the plural for the second half of the 2020s. We're not even close yet. I will end on that vent note. Rant,
Thank
sorry.
you. Thanks a lot, Jez. I'm going to push us a little bit longer on time because this is such an excellent panel. This is such a relevant discussion we're having right now. And I want us to try to end on a slightly high note. So I'm going to squeeze in a final question from the audience, from Oliver Meyer, who asks two questions. How is COVID likely to change the relationship between the WHO and the BWC? Again, speaking to these two worlds of health and security. And the second question, does COVID strengthen the case for more transparency on BW defense programs? I'm not saying you have to answer these questions. What I actually want you to answer, preferably in a one word or one sentence sort of way, is what are the key lessons from COVID-19 in areas of biological disarmament and global health? Where do you see biological disarmament needing to go from here? Essentially, what is your vision for the BWC beyond 50? Really, very final word from each one of you, and then we'll close the session. I know the next we're reconvening again at 10:15, so we've really just got a minute or two. But if you'd like to have a final word, please, Aidan, can we start with you?
Thanks. Yeah, and just to say, I couldn't agree more with what Jez just said. I think it's really important to remember the lessons of the verification protocol negotiation properly, not sort of the opportunistic spin that's put on it by some states now. And in fact, I won't go into more detail, but the UK put out a working paper under MX5 last year in 2019 on just this. So if you want more details about what we think about that, then look at that. But many of the states now who protest vigorously that the only way forward is a verification protocol were the very ones who were not ready to go there last time round. And the US pulled the plug, and they've paid the political price ever since. But there were many more who weren't ready, and including some of the ones who now pretend they were. I think the only other things I'd say is that, given the urgency of these problems, given the political difficulties that we've got in the BWC, we also need to look more widely. We've already talked about the UNSGM. I'll give a quick plug now for the G7 Global Partnership. It's G7 led, but there are about 30 members as well. It's a worldwide issue. This is about sort of preventing the spread of sensitive materials. It's got a big biosecurity program program as well. The UK is chairing that next year, and I think that's a really important body as well. But I think the sort of transparency and confidence building approach in the BWC has been the only one we've been allowed to pursue over the last few years, and I think there's much more we could do on that, even if the political will isn't there on some of the other issues that we've been talking about. Really sort of investing in the TCBM's process, I think is really important.
Thank you, Aidan. Iris, any last comments in 30 seconds or less?
Just on the question of the relationship between WHO and the BWC, I mean, that interest was relatively high in the early 2000s, and my observation is that the interrelationship kind of like became less and less interesting, particularly on the WHO side. And that's probably because WHO has always been this humanitarian outlook on health crisis, and they have been there for some of the CW uses in Syria, kind of supporting investigation, but also the response, the humanitarian response. So I think for them it's relatively clear they are there for the public health, for the health side, healthcare side, and there is relatively little in terms of interaction that is required. Good coordination of who's doing what. And I'm sure there can be done something more, but I don't think we will see a bigger interaction. And my very last point is, and that's again from my public health perspective, I would encourage everyone to look at their governments and how they invest in the local healthcare, in the public health capacities, and particularly in the core capacities of the international health regulations. And those include biosecurity issues. So those include security aspects of dealing with the modern life sciences. And if countries do that, they would be well prepared for the public health effects of a bioweapons use, and that's already a big step in preventing too many people dying, too many people getting sick. And I think that would be my last statement. Invest in health.
Invest in health, indeed. Thank you, Iris. Jez, the last word is with you again.
Okay, so I always think of a broader anti-biological weapons regime. And the BWC is at the foundation of that, as with the Geneva Protocol. But it's got lots of layers and lots of different complex mechanisms in place. The WHO is one, UNSCR 1540 is another, the UNSG investigation mechanism. But, there are lots and lots of issues. We have to take care of the foundation, which is the BWC. So we can't ignore the BWC, and we can't leave it to be a playground of states who are less than transparent and democratic, is how I will politely put it. But going forward, how we strengthen the anti-biological weapons regime through the BWC is not the only route we can do that. And I think we can't let our past define our future options. So we really need to rethink this issue of what does biological disarmament look like in the next 25 to 30 years. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Jez. A very warm thanks to all three speakers, especially Jez, who for now it's, I think, 2:00 in the morning. This has been a wonderful session, absolutely jam-packed with substance, hopefully also lots of inspiring points to follow up on in future conversations. For now, we will reconvene. We have a 4 minutes break and we will reconvene at 10:15. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.